Are bigger miniatures really better? Today we're going to find out. Hey everyone, welcome back to Anvil Do Miniatures. My name is Dietz, and a couple weeks ago I was lucky enough to jump on a plane and head south to cold old Melbourne in Australia for PAX. PAX Australia is kind of like our version of E3, which they have in the United States, but we have a big presence of tabletop wargaming, tabletop games, card games, all sorts of things. And unfortunately, or fortunately, it gave me a new obsession of Magic cards. I can't stop playing it. I play my missus like every night and I absolutely destroy her. I even met these legends here from Tabletop Time, and as you can see, I was fangirling out a little bit. I really didn't know what to say to them, so if you guys ever do watch this video, I'm sorry if I was a bit awkward. But I love your stuff. Now, while I was roaming around the PAX halls, one tabletop caught my eye. I saw a whole lot of these familiar miniatures which I know and love, but at a 10mm scale. And as a few of you out there know, it's from the game War Master. It was released over 20 years ago, and unfortunately it was discontinued around 2013. But it's been kept alive thanks to some devoted fans. Now, I wasn't not going to give this game a go, and after waiting about an hour, I had my table, I had my opponent, and I had Adam, the legend, who was going to run me through the game and kind of guide me and help me as I never played this before. Now, I got paired with the Orcs and Goblins, and my opponent got paired with a Skaven, and I might add that he was an experienced veteran of Warhammer Fantasy battles. Now, I'm not going to get into the game too much as this is not a battle report, but basically I got flogged. I had one really great turn where there was a glimmer of hope and I thought that I could win, but unfortunately the next turn, the guy I was playing had so many good rolls, he sandwiched me, absolutely destroyed me. There was so much confusion going on with my Orcs and Goblins, and yeah, I lost. I was laying in my hotel room that night thinking of what I should have done different, but if you're out there, mate, I want a rematch. And I want to play with High Elves this time. I'm not too upset because I got my hands on these beautifully printed 10mm minis from Adra Labs, and I'm going to paint these up for you today. I'll put the link down to Adra Labs' website in the description, but I recommend jumping on their website because if you're into War Master or want to get involved, they have full War Master armies as they supply STL files and fully printed armies, and they pretty much have all the Warhammer Fantasy armies you know and love. When I was on the flight home from Melbourne, I was thinking to myself, how am I going to paint these miniatures? They're so tiny. And one thing came to mind, slap chop. Now, I've never slap chopped before, and this will be a first time for me, so it's going to be a bit of a test. Before I get into it, please hit the like and the subscribe button. I really appreciate it. Let's get into it. The reason why I'm attempting slap chop for these models is simply because the details are absolutely tiny, and I wasn't sure if I'd be able to paint them the traditional way. So first up, I just trimmed off the supports to each one just to get them prepped for the undercoat, and this was oddly satisfying. I gave them a quick prime of Chaos Black, and then it was straight into dry brushing. I just used Vallejo White for this and grabbed an old brush, and I just trimmed off the point to make it a bit more flat, as I thought this might help a little bit. Now, I'm no dry brushing pro. I have done it on the odd square base here and there, but I suggest you look up some of the great dry brushing tutorials that are out there on YouTube because there are plenty. Now, with 6 of these minis to get through, I decided to keep it to 1 hour per mini. I didn't want to get carried away like usual. So first up was the Dark Elf Malice Darkblade, and as this was the first mini, it was going to be very experimental. I wanted to apply my washes to the larger areas of the models first, and then hit it with any details later on. I slapped on some purple for the cape and then some green for the cold one. I then just went around applying a range of different washes to different places. Now, if I didn't have a wash that I needed, I simply made it with a bit of paint and water. I feel like this worked well enough, and it kind of tied it together just fine. I wanted to keep this guy pretty dark, so I kind of glazed gunmetal to the sword and the edges around the armor. Then I slapped on some gold to certain areas around the armor and the sword just to give it a nice little pop. I then hit a few areas with a couple extra washes like the face and the hair. The green was looking a little flat, so I just added some Flash Gits Yellow to the cold one's larger scales as well. And after that, it was time just to hit it with a silver highlight all over the armor. So the Dark Elf is now done, and that took me around half an hour, which I'm pretty happy with. But now it's time to jump onto the Vampire. So as the Vampire's horse is a bit zombified, I just used Skeleton Horde to the body, and then I applied Achillean Green to the cloth. This color is pretty great, and I definitely plan on using it again. I then slapped on some more washes using reds and washed down blacks to keep in with the theme of the Vampire counts. And then it was time for some true metallic metals, and I used the same approach that I did for the Dark Elf and highlighted certain areas that stood out to me. I added some gold to the sword, her fancy tiara, and some little spots around the armor just to give her some points of interest and make sure that she wasn't so one-dimensional. The red armor was looking a little flat to me, so I threw on some small highlights using Wild Rider Red. And then using Pallid Witch Flesh, I carefully highlighted her face, and oh boy was this tricky. So that's 2 down and 4 more to go, and Harry the Hammer is up next. This guy was way more simple as he was nice and dark already from the black primer, so I just threw on some brown washes and a nice red wash for the cape. I also used a little bit of skeleton horde just for the horns and the bones on the horse. One thing I learned pretty quickly is that it's better to undersaturate than oversaturate when applying the washes. If something is too dull, I would wait for it to dry and then just hit it again to boost the colour. I wanted to try some more dry brushing, so after I finished the washes, I pulled out the dry brush again and just used gunmetal, and I went over the chainmail, the armour panels, the hammer, the shield, all super carefully. This just gave it that nice black worn armour look that Chaos units generally have. I then went around with some more gunmetal to any parts that needed it just with the brush, and then gave him some gold highlights to the shield, the helmet, and the armour panels. Being a Chaos unit, I thought this gold was a little bit too bright, so I just used a wash of Guilliman flesh to tone it down a little bit. I then gave him a few highlights here and there to points of interest like the horse's eyes with red, and then just the horns of the model using some bone white here and there. So all the bad boys and girls are now done, it's time to move on to the good guys, if you want to call them that. The Wood Elf Spellweaver was up next, and I was really looking forward to this one because I do love a good unicorn. Now I didn't have any washes suitable for the white horse, so I went down the traditional painting route and built up some layers of Administratum Grey and then added smaller bits of white to the unicorn, and I felt like this worked pretty well. White is always hard to work with, so I was pretty pleased that it didn't look like too much of a mess. I then applied some green washes to the unicorn's mane and tail, and then I added some brown washes to the clothing and the staff. And then I mixed up an alternate green wash and I just used that on her cape. I hit the hair with some watered down Doombull brown all over, and then gave it some small highlights with Scrag brown, and then just a final highlight of Balor brown. Now I was a little concerned about the skin because there was a lot of it compared to the other models. I didn't want it to look like it was glowing or a big blob of pinky white. So I washed it down with Guilliman flesh and then hit it with some Kislev flesh all over. I then mixed in some white to the Kislev flesh and just did a small highlight here and there. To finish this girl up, I went over some polished gold to her little crown. And you know me, I never leave a gem behind, and even though these guys are 10mm in size, this wasn't going to stop me. So I hit the staff gem with some moot green. I then watered down some black paint and applied that to the top right. I mixed up some white and moot green and applied that down the bottom left. And to finish up the gems, I added a tiny little white dot to the top right area. I then gave that unicorn a set of beautiful blue eyes. Okay, she's done, and now it's time for the Green Knight. Now this guy was super simple because it had so much green on him. I slapped on a green wash all over the horse and the banners. It took me around 2 coats to get the green colour where I wanted it. Then, using a black wash, I went all over the armour panels. I just did this to build up some contrast for when I apply the silver over the top of these. I mixed up another green wash and applied that to a few different places. It was good to use a couple different greens because I didn't want it looking too singular and too blob-like, and just give it a point of difference. The horse got a wash of black all over, then it was time for some gunmetal on the armour panels and a small highlight of silver to any of the tips. I then added some small details to the sword and then some highlights to the horse's cloth. I thought this would give it some good points of interest and make the model stand out just a little bit more. I also attempted the world's tiniest fleur de lis. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong, and as you can tell, I butchered it. So I'm sorry to all the Bretonnian lovers out there. I tried my best, but next time I will do better. Now I think I left the best till last. You know how much I love high elves, and with this guy here, I'm going to spend 2 hours instead of the 1 hour on it, and maybe take my time and try paint this one a little bit better. I've gained some confidence after painting the first 5, so let's see how I go with this guy. So one thing I noticed was that the dry brush was leaving a little bit of a speckle, and that was probably due to me being shit at dry brushing and going in too dry. So I decided to build up the highlights all over the model using the same grey and white technique that I did for the Wood Elf's unicorn. I went all over carefully with Administratum Grey, being super careful not to get too much in the recesses. I then mixed in some white to the grey and then added this to a smaller area and just built up the layers. Time for some washes, and I hit all the cloths and capes with Citadel Frostheart contrast paint And again, I found a really nice paint that I really love and I definitely will use again. Then it was time to hit the dragon on the helmet and the horse's bridle with a red wash. So at this point you can probably tell I left the slap chop method behind a little bit. I started to gain some confidence with my brush strokes and with my detail, so I kind of threw that out and started painting it the regular way I painted. So sorry if you wanted to see pure slap chop, I just couldn't control myself. I wanted this Tyrion to be a true high elf hero, so obviously there was going to be plenty of silver and gold, so I went over some gunmetal to the armor panels and then used some Gehenna's gold to the little ornate parts and all over the trim on the horse. This was pretty tricky and required a steady hand. After spending 15 minutes doing this, I had hand cramps, but it was totally worth it. Using a really skinny brush, I used an initial red highlight with Wild Rider Red, and then I did a final highlight with Orange Flare to finish it off. And I just applied that to the dragon on the head, the tassels, and the horse's bridle. I hit the blue capes with highlights of Lothern Blue to the raised areas and took my time placing them to each fold on the cloth. Then I mixed in some Blue Horror to the Lothern Blue and applied another highlight. And to finish up those glorious high elf robes, I just went over with pure Blue Horror. After that, I glazed a little bit of silver over the gunmetal to make that true metallic really shiny. Now the golds were looking pretty bright and I just wanted to give them some contrast and tone them down a bit, so I just gave them a hit of Guilliman Flesh Wash all over. And then for the highlight, I just went over super carefully with polished gold until I was satisfied. Now, like any good high elf, this guy had about 13 gems that all needed to be painted. So I carefully placed down some Evil Sunz Scarlet over every single gem and then applied a watered down black wash to the top right of each gem. I mixed in some white to the Evil Sunz to get a nice little pink color and I applied that to the bottom left. And last up was a nice little dot of pure white over all 13 of these suckers. Here are my 10mm Warmaster 3D prints from Adra Labs. Thanks so much for sticking around, guys. I really appreciate it. Again, check out Adra Labs. The link is in the description. Also, thanks so much to my mate Kieran at HopK88 Gaming for taking the time and filming me while I was playing the Warmaster game. I really appreciate it, mate. Make sure you check him out. I got his link in the description as well. And if you want to see me paint more Warmaster minis or anything like that, let me know down in the comments below. I'd really love to know if you'd love to see me paint a whole army of these 10mm minis as well. Anyway, thanks so much, guys. I'll see you next time. Cheers.